My name is Alexis. I'm in my late 30s now, old enough to have lived a few versions of myself, young enough to remember what it felt like to believe permanence was a promise people kept. For most of my adult life, I was a wife, a professional, the person who remembered birthdays and renewal dates, who made sure the lights stayed on and the conversations stayed polite. If you met me then, you probably would have described me as steady, calm, the kind of woman who doesn't need to be loud to be present. People tend to underestimate women like me, not because we lack intelligence or ambition, but because we don't announce either. I was often perceived as agreeable, supportive, and low maintenance, the strong one in that quiet way that actually means she'll handle it. I let that perception stand for a long time, partly because it made life easier, partly because I didn't yet understand the cost of being consistently misunderstood. This story isn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense. There are no screaming matches, no shocking revelations delivered in public places. It's about something slower and, in many ways, more disorienting. It's about realization, about the moment you understand that the life you thought you were building together was never truly mutual. That while you were planning decades, someone else was only planning exits. At its core, this is the story of how I found out my husband never planned to grow old with me, not through a confession, but through patterns, omissions, and a future I was never invited into. And when I finally saw it clearly, what hurt most wasn't anger. It was the quiet clarity of realizing I wasn't in their future at all. What follows is not a revenge story. I didn't set out to punish anyone, and I didn't burn my life down for the sake of spectacle. This is a documentary-style account of emotional justice, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but restores balance all the same. I'm sharing it because there are so many people living inside relationships where they are valued for their function, not their presence, where silence is mistaken for consent. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through who I was to them, the small moments most people would dismiss, the shift that happened entirely inside me, and the choices that followed. There is no villain monologue here, and no sudden hero's triumph, just honesty, accountability, and the quiet power that comes from finally seeing the truth and responding with intention. If you're listening to this, maybe you felt that subtle disconnect before, the sense that you're investing in something more deeply than the person beside you. Before we go any further, I want to ask you gently, have you ever wondered whether the future you were planning was actually shared or simply parallel? For a long time, I believed I knew exactly who I was in my marriage. I was the stabilizer, the reliable constant, the person who made things run without ever needing to be asked. I paid attention to the invisible details, the kind that only become noticeable when they're missing. Bills were paid early, appointments were remembered, family obligations were anticipated before they turned into stress. I didn't see this as a sacrifice. I saw it as a partnership. To my husband and to many people around us, I was easy to be with. Not demanding, not dramatic, the kind of woman other men complimented him for having. They'd say things like, "You're lucky, she's so understanding," or "She's low maintenance, that's rare." He would smile when they said that. Sometimes he'd nod, as if he agreed with their assessment. I did too, at first. Understanding felt like a virtue. Flexibility felt like love. What I didn't realize then was that I was being quietly categorized. Not as someone to grow with, but as someone who would adapt. Someone whose presence was assumed, not actively chosen. I was part of the structure of his life, not the vision of it. When he talked about the future, it was always abstract. Someday, eventually, down the line. He spoke in placeholders, career moves he might make, cities he might want to live in, projects he dreamed of pursuing. I listened, asked questions, and offered support. I pictured myself naturally included because why wouldn't I be? We were married, we shared a home, a bed, a rhythm. But if I'm honest, even then, the language was subtle. He said I far more than we. At the time, I told myself that it was normal. Independence was healthy. Not everything had to be merged. That's what emotionally mature people believed, right? So I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't say, where do I fit into that? Because I thought the answer was obvious. To his family, I was dependable. The one who showed up on time, remembered preferences, and smoothed over awkward moments. They trusted me. They relied on me. But they didn't really ask me questions about my inner life. Conversations stayed practical, safe. I was appreciated, but not deeply known. At gatherings, I noticed how decisions were discussed around me, not with me. Plans adjusted themselves, assuming my compliance. Alexis will be fine with that. Alexis doesn't mind. And because I rarely objected, because I could usually make things work, the assumption solidified into truth. At work, it was similar. I was respected, but in a quiet, utilitarian way. The person you give responsibility to because you know it will be handled, not because you're curious about how they think. I was seen as competent, not expansive. None of this felt like cruelty. That's important to say. There was no obvious malice, no single moment I could point to and say, that's where it broke. It was more like erosion, the slow wearing away of being fully perceived, and I played a role in it. I won't pretend otherwise. I had learned, long before my marriage, that being self-sufficient made me safe, that needing less made me valuable. So I edited myself, softened edges, let things slide. I told myself I was choosing peace. What I didn't see was that peace, when it's one-sided, becomes invisibility. To them, I was the background that made their lives smoother, the constant that didn't require recalibration. I wasn't a problem to solve or a future to plan around. I was just there, reliable, replaceable, though no one ever said that out loud. And the most unsettling part? I didn't feel unloved. I felt unconsidered. There's a difference. Love, even flawed love, engages with you. Consideration requires seeing you as someone whose presence alters decisions, someone whose absence would change the shape of things. Back then, I didn't know how much that distinction would come to matter. I only knew that I was tired in a way rest didn't fix. That something about my life felt oddly provisional, as if I were living in a space that could be rearranged without my consent. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself I was overthinking. That stability was boring by nature, that not everything needed to be interrogated. I didn't yet understand that this was how the story began, not with a betrayal, but with a role quietly assigned and slowly accepted. The first time it happened, it was so small I almost missed it. We were at a dinner with friends, one of those relaxed midweek gatherings where no one dresses up and the conversation drifts easily between work, travel, and vague future plans. Someone asked a harmless question about where we saw ourselves in 5 or 10 years. It wasn't directed at me specifically. It floated in the middle of the table, open to anyone. My husband answered without hesitation. He talked about career opportunities he was considering, a possible move, a different pace of life he imagined for himself. He spoke clearly, confidently, like someone who had rehearsed these thoughts before. Everyone listened, heads nodded. Someone asked a follow-up question. I waited for the natural pause where he would include me, where he would say we, or at least glance in my direction, inviting me into the vision he was sharing. It never came. Instead, the conversation moved on as if his future had been fully described, as if it were complete on its own. I smiled. I sipped my drink. I told myself I was being sensitive. After all, it wasn't a formal declaration. It was just dinner. Just talk. And yet something in me registered the absence like a paper cut, minor, almost invisible, but sharp enough to draw attention. Later that night, in the quiet of our kitchen, I mentioned it lightly, not accusing, not emotional, just curious. You talked about the future tonight, I said, rinsing a glass. I noticed you didn't include me. Was that intentional? He looked genuinely surprised, not defensive, not angry, just puzzled. "Oh," he said, "I didn't think about it like that. You know you're part of it." That was the moment most people would let it go. And I did. I nodded. I accepted the reassurance. Because on the surface, it made sense. Not everything needs to be verbalized. Some things are implied, but implication only works when it's mutual. Over the next few weeks, I noticed similar moments. Tiny ones, easily dismissible, decisions made without checking in. Plans were tentatively formed and then presented to me as finished thoughts. Nothing outrageous, nothing that would alarm a friend if I described it. So I didn't describe it. Instead, I started noticing how often my presence was assumed rather than invited, how my agreement was expected, not requested, how I forgot to mention it became a common phrase. Once, he booked a work trip that overlapped with something important to me. When I reminded him, he apologized quickly, genuinely. But the apology focused on logistics, not awareness. "We'll figure it out. Not that I should have thought of you." Again, I told myself this was normal. People are busy. No one is perfect. Relationships are about compromise, and I was good at compromise. I had built a life on it. What made these moments different was how alone they felt. Not because I was excluded deliberately, but because my inclusion didn't seem to require maintenance. I was a given, a constant variable. I began to sense that there was a version of his life he carried privately, one where decisions were made in solitude, and I was integrated afterward, if necessary. I wasn't consulted at the moment of imagining, only at the moment of adjusting. Still, I stayed calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand change. I didn't want to be the person who made everything heavier. I believed that if I handled these moments with enough grace, they would correct themselves. But something subtle shifted inside me. I started remembering, not obsessively, not angrily, just accurately. I didn't write anything down yet. I didn't confront him with patterns. I simply stopped dismissing my own perception. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar. But it taught me something important. That clarity doesn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet discomfort you keep explaining away until one day you can't anymore. And while everyone else moved on from those moments instantly, I didn't. I carried them with me, not as weapons, but as data. At the time, I didn't know why I was paying such close attention. I only knew that something about being repeatedly overlooked changes the way you listen, changes the way you interpret silence. I was still committed, still present, still loving in the ways I knew how to be. But somewhere beneath that, a question had formed, small, unspoken, and persistent. If I stopped adjusting, would anyone notice? Once something has a reasonable explanation, it becomes dangerously easy to accept. That's what I did next. I normalized it. Each small dismissal arrived with a ready-made justification. He was busy. He was stressed. He wasn't intentionally excluding me. And because none of it came with cruelty or raised voices, it didn't feel like disrespect. It felt like an inconvenience, like misalignment, like something mature adults worked around. So I worked around it. When plans changed without my input, I adjusted my schedule. When decisions were already made, I focused on making them functional. When my opinion wasn't asked for, I offered it gently, if at all. I told myself that choosing my battles was wisdom, not avoidance. What I didn't realize was that I was training everyone, including myself, on how little input I required. The more adaptable I became, the less anyone checked. Why would they? I made it easy. I didn't create friction. I absorbed the impact quietly and kept moving. Friends would say things like, "You're so chill about everything," or "I don't know how you stay so calm." They meant it as a compliment. I accepted it as one. Being unbothered had become part of my identity. Inside, though, something was flattening. I noticed how often I was the last to know things. Not because information was hidden from me, but because it wasn't prioritized. A change in plans was mentioned casually, a decision revealed in passing, always with a tone that assumed I'd be fine with it. And I usually was. or at least I made myself be. I told myself that love didn't require constant negotiation, that independence was healthy, that I didn't want to be controlling or needy. I had seen relationships where every decision turned into a debate, and I promised myself I wouldn't become that person, so I stayed quiet. But quiet, when it becomes habitual, stops being a choice. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when I caught myself editing a sentence before speaking. Not because it was unkind or unreasonable, but because I didn't want to slow things down. I didn't want to complicate the flow. That's when I realized I had started to think of my own needs as interruptions. That realization should have alarmed me. Instead, I rationalized it. This is what partnership looks like, I thought. Flexibility, understanding. What I didn't name then was how one-sided it had become. I was adjusting to a life that was being shaped elsewhere. My presence was assumed, but my perspective was optional. And because I rarely objected, no one had to confront the imbalance. My husband wasn't dismissive in obvious ways. He wasn't unkind. He listened when I spoke, when I did speak. He just didn't orient himself around my voice. I was adjacent to his decisions, not central to them. And slowly, that became normal. I stopped expecting consultation, stopped anticipating shared planning. I learned how to fit into outlines that were already drawn. I told myself I was being supportive, but what I was really doing was shrinking my footprint to avoid being in the way. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being valued for your cooperation rather than your contribution. It doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like being quietly bypassed. I didn't talk about this with anyone. Not because I was protecting him, but because I couldn't quite articulate what was wrong. If I tried to explain it, it sounded petty, vague, ungrateful. So I stayed silent and told myself that if it were serious, it would be obvious. But the thing about disrespect, when it's normalized, is that it doesn't announce itself. It blends in. It wears the mask of reasonableness. And because I was so good at being reasonable, I didn't notice how much ground I was losing. Still, I believed in us. I believed that commitment meant weathering phases, that not every discomfort required confrontation, that patience would eventually be met with reciprocity. I didn't yet understand that by the time reciprocity is expected, the roles have often already been set. I had become the adaptable one, the understanding one, the one who didn't need much. And once that identity hardens, people stop imagining a future where they ask for more. It didn't happen in a single moment. No one sat me down and explained my role. There was no announcement, no agreement I consciously signed. I simply woke up one day and realized I knew exactly what was expected of me. I was the reliable one, the one who would handle things without complaint, the one who could be counted on to adapt, to accommodate, to smooth out whatever edges life presented. I was useful, efficient, emotionally steady, and quietly invisible. I saw it in the way plans were formed. My availability was assumed, not confirmed. My preferences were secondary to practicality. If something needed to be rearranged, it was understood that I would be the one to adjust. Not because anyone demanded it, but because that's how it had always gone. At first, I mistook this for trust. They rely on me, I thought. That means I matter. But reliance is not the same as regard. My husband had come to see me as part of the infrastructure of his life, necessary but not consulted, present but not centered. I wasn't someone whose desires reshaped the plan. I was someone who made the plan work. And the unsettling part was how natural it felt to everyone else. His family didn't ask me where I wanted the holidays to be spent. They asked me what time I'd arrive. Friends didn't ask for my opinion when discussing future trips. They asked if I'd be okay with the dates already chosen. Even at work, I noticed how decisions were finalized and then handed to me to implement. I had become the executor, not the architect. There's a subtle psychological shift that happens when people stop seeing you as someone with competing priorities and start seeing you as someone whose life can bend without consequence. It's not malicious, it's efficient. And I had made myself very efficient. I rarely said no. I rarely disrupted momentum. I prided myself on being composed, on not needing reassurance, on not demanding attention. Somewhere along the way, that composure was mistaken for the absence of need. The role I was assigned didn't come with cruelty, but it came with erasure. I was expected to be understanding in moments that required consideration, expected to be flexible in situations that required mutuality, expected to absorb disappointment quietly so that others wouldn't have to feel it. And because I could, I did. What I didn't see at first was how this role benefited everyone except me. It kept things smooth, predictable, low friction. It allowed others to move quickly, decisively, without having to pause and ask how their choices might land. I was the pause they no longer needed. There was a moment, small and almost forgettable, when this became clear. Someone asked my husband if a certain long-term plan would work for both of you. He answered easily, without looking at me. "She'll be fine," he said. "Not that we've talked about it. No, we're still figuring it out. Just, she'll be fine." And everyone accepted that answer, including me in that moment. Later, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how confidently he spoke on my behalf, about how little curiosity there was about my internal world, about how being fine had become my defining trait. I wasn't asked what I wanted because I had proven I could live without being asked. That's when I began to understand something uncomfortable. Roles, once established, are rarely questioned. People build their expectations around them. They plan futures, assuming they will hold. And in that future, my role was clear. I was the support structure, the stabilizer, the person who made things possible without needing to be acknowledged as a person whose own life had direction. I wasn't seen as someone with a separate trajectory. I was seen as an accessory to someone else's. Still, I didn't confront it, not yet. But internally, something had shifted from endurance to awareness. I began to observe my life as if from a slight distance, noticing patterns I had once smoothed over. I paid attention to what was assumed, what was omitted, and what was never asked. The role I had been assigned no longer felt neutral. It felt intentional. And once you see the shape of a role, you can't unsee how much of your future it occupies, unless you choose to step out of it. There wasn't a fight. There wasn't even a conversation. That's what makes the moment difficult to explain to people who expect transformation to arrive with noise. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was alone, sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through paperwork that had accumulated in one of those quiet domestic piles that only ever seem to grow. Mail, notes, receipts, the mundane evidence of a shared life. I remember the light clearly. Late afternoon, soft but fading. The house was quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence usually does. I came across a document my husband had been working on, a long-term professional outline, not hidden, not secret, just not shared with me. It listed goals, timelines, potential relocations, and financial benchmarks. It was thoughtful, detailed, carefully considered. I read it slowly. At first, I was impressed. It was thorough, strategic. This was someone thinking seriously about his future, about the next decade of his life. And then the realization arrived, not sharply, but with a strange calm. I wasn't there. Not in the margins, not in the contingencies, not even as an assumed presence. There was no mention of partnership, of shared decision-making, of how these choices would intersect with another person's life. The future was mapped as a solo journey. I didn't feel shocked. I felt oriented. It was as if something inside me finally aligned with what I had been sensing for a long time. All the small omissions, the casual assumptions, the way my life had been treated as adjustable, it all made sense now. This wasn't neglect, it was designed. And suddenly, I understood the truth I had been avoiding. I found out my husband never planned to grow old with me. Not because he intended to leave dramatically, but because in his long-term imagination, I simply didn't exist. I wasn't in their future at all. The words didn't come with panic. They came with clarity. I sat there for a long time after reading that document. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger. What I felt was something quieter and more decisive. I felt relieved. Not from the marriage itself, not yet, but from the confusion, from the endless self-questioning, from the habit of wondering whether I was asking for too much. I realized then that nothing was wrong with my needs. They just weren't relevant to someone who hadn't factored me into his plans. That afternoon marks the end of something important inside me. The end of hoping that patience would eventually turn into inclusion. The end of believing that silence would be interpreted as strength rather than absence. I didn't confront him. There was nothing to confront yet. He hadn't lied. He hadn't promised anything he hadn't already withheld. Instead, I made a quiet decision. I stopped trying to earn consideration. I began to observe instead of explain, to listen without filling in gaps, to notice what was done versus what was said. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else, but it was profound for me. From that day forward, I understood that clarity doesn't require permission, that awareness is not betrayal. Seeing the truth of your situation doesn't make you disloyal. It makes you responsible to yourself. I didn't know what I would do with that clarity yet. I only knew that I would no longer build my life around assumptions that weren't mutual. That afternoon, in the quiet of my own kitchen, something fundamental rebalanced. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I didn't demand answers. I simply stopped being available for a future that had never made room for me. After that day, my silence changed. Before, it had been automatic, an instinctive smoothing over, a reflex shaped by years of being the adaptable one. Now it was deliberate, measured, no longer a default, but a decision. I didn't announce anything. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance in obvious ways. On the surface, I remained exactly who I had always been, reliable, calm, present. But internally, I was no longer filling in the blanks for anyone. When my husband talked about work, about ideas, about possibilities, I listened without inserting myself into the narrative. I stopped offering unprompted support for plans that didn't include me. I didn't challenge him, but I also didn't translate his vision into something that accommodated my life. And interestingly, no one noticed. That, more than anything, confirmed what I had begun to understand. My presence had never been required for the story to move forward. I had simply been useful in making it smoother. Silence in this new form became a way of observing truth without interference. I paid attention to what happened when I didn't volunteer, when I didn't anticipate needs, when I didn't soften outcomes. The world around me didn't collapse. Plans continued, decisions were made, and I was still assumed to be fine. My husband interpreted my quiet as ease, comfort, agreement. He had no reason to question it. After all, this was who I had always been. The difference was that now I was no longer internally aligning myself with his direction. I was gathering information. I began noticing how often my input was only sought when something needed to be fixed, managed, or optimized, not when something was being imagined. I was called in at the execution phase, not the vision phase, and I responded accordingly. I handled what was mine to handle. I fulfilled responsibilities, but I stopped investing emotionally in futures that didn't acknowledge me. I stopped lending my energy to outcomes I hadn't been invited to shape. There's a misconception that silence is passive. That means acquiescence or fear. In my case, it became a form of boundary, not one drawn with words, but with attention. I redirected my attention inward. I started asking myself questions I had avoided for years. What did I want my life to look like in 10 years? Where did I want to live? What kind of days did I want to wake up to? These questions felt unfamiliar at first, like muscles I hadn't used in a long time. And as I considered them, something else became clear. My husband wasn't planning a future that excluded me maliciously. He was planning a future that prioritized himself entirely. I had simply been willing to orbit it. That realization didn't make me resent him. It made me recalibrate my own center. Silence gave me space. Space to stop reacting, space to stop explaining, space to see patterns without rushing to resolve them. I also noticed how people respond when you stop overfunctioning. Some lean in, others drift, a few grow uncomfortable. but the most revealing response is indifference. Indifference tells you exactly how necessary your extra effort was. As weeks passed, my calm remained. My demeanor is unchanged, but my internal posture was different. I was no longer waiting to be included. I was no longer hoping someone would notice my restraint and reward it with consideration. I had accepted something essential. If I wanted a future that truly belonged to me, I would have to stop assuming I was part of someone else's. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not absence. It's preparation. While everything on the surface remained unchanged, a different kind of work began quietly underneath. No one noticed because no one was looking. I didn't suddenly become secretive. I didn't lock my phone or change my routines. I continued to move through my days with the same calm efficiency I always had. That consistency became my cover, not intentionally at first, but effectively. What changed was where I placed my attention. I began documenting things, not obsessively, not emotionally, methodically. Conversations, decisions, timelines. I didn't write commentary. I wrote facts, dates, phrases used, outcomes, patterns. The slim leather notebook I'd carried for years stopped being a place for reminders and became a quiet record of reality. This wasn't about building a case against anyone. It was about building clarity for myself. I reviewed our finances, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I realized how little I actually knew about the long-term structure of our shared life. I traced accounts, savings, investments, retirement plans. I noticed which plans were joint and which were individual, which had contingencies and which assumed autonomy. Again, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just asymmetry. I began learning, not loudly, not with announcements. I read, I listened, I asked neutral questions in professional contexts that had nothing to do with my marriage. I expanded my understanding of financial independence, legal frameworks, and long-term planning. Knowledge I should have had earlier, but hadn't needed until now. All of this happened without confrontation. My husband didn't notice because there was nothing to notice. I wasn't pulling away. I wasn't changing tone. I wasn't creating conflict. I was still dependable, still present, still fine. That was the part that protected me. People only become curious when your behavior disrupts their expectations. Mine didn't. I fulfilled my role perfectly while quietly preparing to step outside of it. I also began repositioning myself emotionally. I stopped sharing certain internal thoughts, not out of secrecy, but out of discernment. I asked myself, does this person need access to this part of me? Often the answer was no. I invested more deeply in my own competence, took on projects that sharpened my skills, built confidence that wasn't mirrored back to me, but generated internally. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was stabilizing my own footing. What surprised me most was how easy it was to do this unnoticed. The world had become accustomed to me carrying weight quietly, so when I shifted what I carried, no one thought to ask why. There's a kind of power in being underestimated, not the performative kind, but the practical kind. When people assume you are static, they don't track your movement. When they assume you are content, they don't question your preparation. I wasn't hiding. I was simply no longer explaining myself. I noticed how often people confuse emotional transparency with loyalty. How do they expect access as proof of connection? I had given that access freely for years. Now I limited it without apology. This wasn't bitterness, it was alignment. I was aligning my internal reality with my external behavior, no longer compensating for others' omissions, no longer making myself smaller to preserve comfort, and still no one noticed. My husband continued planning, continued speaking in singular terms, continued assuming my flexibility. What he didn't see was that my flexibility had ended, not in anger, but in resolve. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience, like observation, like choosing not to intervene when someone reveals exactly how they see you. What they never noticed was that the version of me they relied on was no longer the version making decisions. And once that separation exists, the outcome becomes inevitable, even if the timing remains quiet. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no satisfaction, no moment where I leaned back and thought, so this is it. Instead, it arrived the way most truths do when you're finally ready to see them, quietly, almost mundanely, wrapped in confirmation rather than shock. I was reviewing documents one evening, the kind of administrative work I had always handled without much thought. Accounts, policies, projections, things that had once felt neutral now carried context. And that's when the pattern fully resolved. It wasn't a single document, it was the way several of them lined up, the way timelines converged, the way contingencies were structured, not for us, but for him. Retirement planning that assumed individual relocation. Long-term financial scenarios are modeled without shared variables. Exit flexibility is built in, not discussed. Again, nothing illegal, nothing hidden, just intentional design. I remember sitting there, pen resting on the page, feeling an almost clinical calm. This was the confirmation, not of betrayal, but of alignment. Everything I had observed, everything I had felt but dismissed, it all made sense in one coherent picture. This was leverage, not in the manipulative sense people imagine, but in the structural one. I finally understood where I stood. I understood that while I had been emotionally investing in permanence, he had been architecting optionality. While I had been assuming continuity, he had been preserving mobility. Our definitions of commitment were not the same. The reveal wasn't that he planned to leave tomorrow. It was that he had never planned to stay indefinitely. That distinction matters. I didn't feel superior. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was clarity without emotion attached. The kind that doesn't demand immediate action, but makes inaction impossible. I closed the folder. I put the documents away. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions that would invite half-truths or reassurances. I didn't need them anymore. The private reveal wasn't something I shared with anyone. Not friends, not family, not even myself out loud. It lived quietly inside me, reorganizing my understanding of the past and recalibrating my expectations of the future. This was the moment my options became visible. I saw that I could stay and continue adapting, knowing exactly what that meant. I could confront him and force a conversation he wasn't prepared to have, honestly. Or I could begin shaping an outcome that didn't require his participation at all. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. Leverage doesn't always look like power over someone else. Sometimes it looks like freedom from illusion, from dependency, from needing validation to acting in your own interest. That night, I slept well. Not because I felt resolved, but because uncertainty had finally lifted. The confusion that had kept me awake for years was gone. In its place was something steadier. I knew the truth. And knowing it meant that whatever came next would be deliberate. Not emotional, not reactive, not rushed, just inevitable. Clarity has a strange effect on time. Once I saw the situation for what it was, urgency disappeared. Because nothing mattered anymore, but because I no longer needed to rush toward an answer. The pressure to fix things dissolved. What remained was choice. And choice, when it's real, is quiet. I didn't make a decision all at once. I laid the options out carefully, the way I had learned to do with everything else in my life. I examined them without judgment, without dramatizing any single outcome. I could stay. Staying would mean continuing as I was, competent, adaptable, emotionally self-contained. It would mean accepting that the relationship had a ceiling I would never be invited to raise. It would mean trading depth for stability and presence for proximity. There was comfort in that option, familiarity, predictability. And there was also a slow erosion I could already feel. I could confront him. I imagined that conversation many times, not angrily, not explosively, but calmly, laying out what I had noticed, asking direct questions, forcing clarity into the open. But I was honest with myself about what that would likely produce. Explanations. Reassurances, adjustments made in response to pressure rather than insight, temporary inclusion that depended on my vigilance. A future negotiated only because I had finally demanded one. That wasn't the future I wanted either. Then there was the third option, the one that didn't involve asking, correcting, or convincing. I could choose myself without needing agreement. That option didn't come with drama. It didn't require confrontation right away. It simply required commitment to my own long-term well-being, to a life that didn't rely on being an afterthought in someone else's plans. I took time with that option. I watched how I felt when I imagined my life unfolding on my own terms, not as a reaction to him, but as a continuation of myself. The feeling wasn't fear. It was steadiness, a sense of internal alignment I hadn't felt in years. That was how I knew. The decision point wasn't a moment of anger or heartbreak. It was a moment of self-respect, of recognizing that staying silent indefinitely would cost me more than leaving quietly ever could. I didn't decide to end the marriage that day, not formally, but I did decide on something irreversible. I decided I would no longer organize my life around someone who hadn't organized theirs around me. Once that decision was made internally, everything else became procedural. Timing, logistics, sequencing, those were details. Important ones, but not emotional ones. What mattered was that I had crossed a line inside myself, from hoping to choosing, from waiting to acting. And even then, nothing on the outside changed. I still showed up, still spoke kindly, still handled responsibilities. To anyone watching, nothing was wrong. But internally, the path had been selected. And once a path is chosen with clarity, turning back is no longer an option, only moving forward with intention. Once the decision was made, everything became practical. Not cold, not detached, just clear. I didn't announce a shift because there was no benefit in doing so. Announcements invite reaction, and reaction invites negotiation. I wasn't negotiating anymore. I was implementing. Moving in silence didn't mean disappearing. It meant acting without emotional disclosure. I began with structure. I separated what needed to be separated, not abruptly, not dramatically, but cleanly. Accounts that could be untangled were. Documents were copied and organized, passwords updated, personal records consolidated. Nothing hidden, nothing deceptive. Just preparation that assumed I was responsible for my own future. I consulted professionals in neutral contexts, not as a wife in crisis, but as an individual asking hypothetical questions. What would independence look like in different timelines? What were the implications of various choices? I gathered information the way I always had, thoroughly, unemotionally. At home, I remained consistent. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't provoke distance. I didn't create scenes that would force attention. My steadiness became a kind of camouflage. He had no reason to suspect movement because movement had never been something he tracked in me. And that was the quiet irony. I had spent years being predictable for the sake of peace. Now that predictability allowed me to reposition without interference. I also began redistributing my energy. Less into maintaining harmony, more into strengthening my own footing. I invested in work that expanded my autonomy. I reconnected with parts of myself that didn't exist in relation to anyone else's needs. I noticed how much mental space became available once I stopped monitoring whether I was being included. No one noticed the shift because it didn't inconvenience them. That's something people rarely talk about. How many changes go unseen simply because they don't disrupt comfort. I wasn't making demands. I wasn't creating friction. I was simply preparing for a life that didn't require permission. There were moments of sadness, yes, but they came without panic. Grief doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives as acceptance of what was never going to be. I grieved the version of us I had believed in. I grieved the future I had assumed was mutual, but I didn't grieve the decision itself, because the decision was grounded in truth. Weeks passed, then months. To the outside world, we were unchanged. Inside me, everything had reorganized. I was no longer waiting for alignment. I was creating it. Moving in silence wasn't about secrecy. It was about sovereignty. About refusing to explain choices to someone who had never explained theirs. And as the groundwork settled into place, I understood something important. When consequences finally arrive, they don't begin with impact. They begin with absence. The first consequences didn't look like a loss. They looked confused. It started subtly, the way everything else had. Small disruptions in a system that had long relied on my quiet compensation. Things that had always worked smoothly began requiring attention. Not because I had stopped caring, but because I had stopped preempting. I no longer reminded him of deadlines that weren't mine. I didn't adjust my schedule automatically when his changed. I didn't translate his stress into solutions unless he asked directly. And even then, I offered input, not execution. At first, he didn't notice the pattern. He only noticed the friction. A missed detail here. A delayed response there. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to be inconvenient. He began asking questions, casual ones. Did you see that email? I thought you usually handled this. Did something change? I answered honestly, but minimally. I didn't see it. I didn't realize that was mine. I assumed you had it covered. There was no accusation in my tone, no edge, just factual responses that reflected the reality I had been living in for years. What he felt, I think, was disorientation. The systems he had relied on were still there, but they no longer compensated for his blind spots. The absence wasn't dramatic, it was cumulative, and because it wasn't framed as a conflict, he didn't know how to address it. That's the thing about quiet consequences. They don't announce their arrival. They simply reveal dependencies that were never acknowledged. At work, too, I noticed a shift. When I stopped absorbing excess responsibility without comment, others had to engage more directly. Some rose to it, some didn't. The difference was telling. I wasn't withdrawing. I was recalibrating. My husband started to feel something he couldn't name, a sense that things were less easy, less seamless. He wasn't losing me, not yet, but he was losing the version of me that made everything effortless. An effort, when you are not used to noticing it, feels like loss. He became more attentive in small ways, asked more questions, checked in more often, not out of insight, but out of discomfort. The environment had changed, and he was trying to reorient. But here's the part that mattered most to me. None of that changed the future he was planning. The structure remained the same. His vision still centered on himself. My renewed visibility existed only in the present tense, as a problem to be solved, not a life to be integrated. That's when I knew the consequences would continue. Because once someone experiences the loss of convenience, they may seek repair. But when they experience the loss of control, they seek restoration of the old order. And I was no longer available for that. I watched him struggle, not dramatically, not tragically, but noticeably. And I didn't rush in to steady things. I let reality do its quiet work, not out of punishment, out of respect for the truth. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, it wasn't because of anything I said. It was because the old rhythm no longer worked. He started paying closer attention, noticing gaps where there hadn't been any before, asking questions that used to go unasked, attempting, in small ways, to restore what he felt slipping, without quite understanding what it was. There was a tentative quality to him then. Don't panic yet. More like confusion mixed with irritation. The sense that something familiar had shifted position while he wasn't looking. He tried to compensate in surface ways. He suggested dinners, asked how my day had been more frequently, mentioned future ideas and paused, as if waiting to see whether I would step into the narrative and complete it for him. I didn't. Not because I was withholding affection, but because I was no longer filling roles that had never been mutual. That's when the panic crept in. It wasn't loud. It didn't look like desperation. It looked like restlessness, like someone pacing mentally, trying to locate the lever that used to make everything fall back into place. He asked once carefully, "Are you happy?" It was a question I had asked myself many times before. Now I answered it honestly. "I'm clear," I said. He didn't know what to do with that. Clarity doesn't invite negotiation. It doesn't ask for reassurance. It doesn't leave room for vague promises. And that was the problem. He had relied on vagueness for years. He began offering fixes. "We can talk more. We can plan better. Maybe we should take a trip." These were gestures, not revisions. Adjustments meant to restore comfort, not to reimagine the future. There was still no language of we, only a scramble to repair the present without addressing the structure underneath it. I listened. I stayed calm. I didn't interrupt. And in doing so, I saw clearly that this was too late, not because time had run out, but because intention had never been there. You can't retrofit someone into a future they were never designed for. What he was experiencing wasn't heartbreak yet. It was the loss of assumption, the dawning awareness that the system he depended on no longer responded the way it used to. He asked what I wanted. That question, arriving so late, felt heavier than any argument could have. I told him the truth, not all of it, not yet, but enough. I want to live a life where I don't have to remind someone that I'm part of it. There was silence after that. Not angry silence, just the quiet of something irreversible settling into place. That was when I knew. Even if he tried now, it would always be in response to loss, not in pursuit of shared growth. And I wasn't willing to be someone's corrective lesson. By the time regret arrived, it wasn't dramatic. It was simply ineffective. The conversation, when it finally happened, was quiet. No raised voices, no accusations, no rehearsed speeches. It took place in our living room on an ordinary evening, the kind we had shared hundreds of times before. That familiarity made the calm feel heavier, not lighter. He started it. "I feel like you've already left," he said. I considered that for a moment before responding, not because I needed time to defend myself, but because I wanted to be precise. "I didn't leave," I said. "I stopped pretending I was included." That was the tone of the entire conversation. Clear, unembellished, not cruel. He asked when things had changed. I told him, not in dates, but in realizations. I explained how it felt to be assumed rather than chosen. How being fine had become a way of disappearing. How planning a future without naming the person beside you eventually communicates something undeniable. He listened. Truly listened, and for the first time, I think, he understood the impact of his omissions. But understanding isn't the same as alignment. He explained himself, not defensively, but honestly. He spoke about ambition, about independence, about not wanting to feel constrained by long-term expectations. He didn't mean to exclude me, he said. He just, hadn't thought about things that way. And that, finally spoken aloud, was the truth I had already accepted. I told him I didn't think he was a bad person. I told him I didn't believe he had set out to hurt me. But I also told him something else, something that surprised even me with how calmly it came out. I don't want to build a life where I have to insist on being considered. There was no argument after that. No attempt to persuade me otherwise. Just a quiet acknowledgement that we had been living parallel lives under the same roof. He asked if anything could change my mind. I answered honestly. No, because the change would always be about keeping me, not choosing me. That wasn't said with bitterness. It was said with certainty. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not awkward silence, reflective. Two people are finally seeing the shape of something that had existed for years. The confrontation didn't end with a resolution. It ended with clarity. And clarity, once spoken, doesn't need reinforcement. The version of me that exists now is quieter than the woman I used to be, but she is not smaller. If anything, she takes up more space internally, even if she doesn't announce it. After everything settled, after the logistics were handled, and the shared life was gently, methodically untangled, I noticed something unexpected. There was no urge to explain myself anymore. Not to friends, not to family, not even to him. The story didn't need defending. It stood on its own. I didn't walk away feeling victorious. I walked away feeling aligned. For the first time in years, my decisions began with me. Not as an afterthought, not as an adjustment, but as the point of origin. My days grew quieter, but they also grew clearer. I no longer had to interpret silences or decode half-formed futures. What I wanted mattered simply because it was mine. I learned the difference between peace and numbness. Peace has weight to it. It holds you steady. Numbness just dulls the edges, so you can survive something you shouldn't have to. I also learned that being calm doesn't mean being endlessly accommodating. That strength doesn't require endurance as proof. And that love, real love, is expansive. It makes room instead of asking you to fold. I didn't become hardened. I didn't lose my capacity for care, but I became selective about where I placed it. I no longer confuse reliability with worth or silence with maturity. What changed most was my relationship with time. I stopped living in provisional mode, stopped assuming that my life was something that could always be rearranged later. I plan now, intentionally, with my own presence fully accounted for. Sometimes people ask if I regret not speaking up sooner. I don't. Not because it wouldn't have changed anything, but because I understand who I was then. I was doing the best I could with the awareness I had. Growth doesn't require self-blame. It requires honesty. I don't hate my former life. I don't resent the years I spent being adaptable. They taught me discernment. They taught me the cost of being unseen. And most importantly, they taught me how to recognize quiet exits before they happen. Who I am now is someone who doesn't wait to be included. I include myself. And that, more than anything else, has changed the trajectory of my life. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for a villain, to ask who was wrong, who failed, who should have known better. But life is rarely that clean. What I learned is that some endings don't come from betrayal. They come from misalignment left unexamined for too long, from futures imagined in isolation, from silence that was mistaken for agreement and adaptability that was mistaken for permanence. I don't believe my husband set out to hurt me. I believe he built a life around himself and assumed I would always adjust to fit it. And for a long time I did. Not because I was weak, but because I thought love meant making things easier for the person beside you. What I know now is that love also means making room. Room for another person's desires, their trajectory, their voice in the shaping of what comes next. When that room doesn't exist, no amount of patience can create it. This story isn't a warning against commitment. It's a reminder to examine how commitment is practiced. Whether the future you're working toward has space for more than one center of gravity, whether we is something that's actively planned or just casually assumed. Quiet dominance, for me, was never about control over someone else. It was about reclaiming authorship of my own life without needing permission, explanation, or spectacle. It was choosing dignity over endurance, clarity over comfort. I didn't leave in anger. I didn't leave to teach a lesson. I left because I finally understood that staying would mean shrinking in ways I could no longer justify. And here's the part that matters most. If you find yourself constantly adapting to a future you didn't help design, that's not partnership. If your silence keeps the peace but erases your presence, that's not maturity. And if someone's plans don't naturally include you, no amount of waiting will make them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop asking where you fit and start building where you belong. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever realized, quietly, without drama, that the future you were planning wasn't truly shared?